What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. This is episode 6, and in this episode, I'm going to focus on the evolution of North America from really the mid-1600s to the mid-1700s. In the previous episode, I discussed a handful of things. One was how the English used Ireland as kind of a practice ground, kind of batting cages, if you will, for the colonization of the New World. The second thing I talked about was Native Americans and what happened to Native Americans specifically in North America, and even more specifically what would be the United States in the late 15 through the mid-1600s. There's a demographic crisis, and as European settlement grows in that period, the Native Americans experience a lot of change, most of it not very good. And then the last thing I discussed was the development of and the origination of the first 13 American colonies, which would be, of course, the original 13 states. So if you missed that one, you can go back and check it out. This one I'm going to pick up from where I left off, and I'm going to mostly talk about the colonies as they developed from, as I said, the mid-16 through the mid-1700s. And as always, we're going to start the show with two things. Number one, the questions that you want to be able to answer once you have listened to and absorbed the information from the show. And then secondarily, the sources that I'm using to compile this information, or maybe if not compile, at least kind of affirm it, because a lot of this, as I've said, I've taught for years, and it's stuff that I mostly knew. However, there are definitely some things I learned along the way, so I'm going to share those sources with you guys as I always do. Let's go ahead and get started by going through the questions, okay? So, question 1. How did the English Civil War, the Stuart Restoration, and English pursuit of mercantilism unfold and affect the English colonization of the New World? That's question 1. Question 2, how did King Philip's War, Bacon's Rebellion, and the Dominion of New England fundamentally alter the social, economic, and political trajectories of British North America from 1675 to 1750? And then finally, the last question, how did salutary neglect, immigration, economic trends, and religion all combine to create a uniquely American character? Okay? And as always, here are the sources that I used to put together this information. I'm going to start with a book that I mentioned for the first time in the last episode, although I used it a little bit in the episode before that as well, and that is The Puritans. You can see it there, yeah. The Puritans. It's called The Puritans, A Transatlantic History by David D. Hall, who is a scholar of Puritans in both Europe and North America. So that's the first book. And then we got a couple old standbys, textbooks. There's The Earth and Its Peoples, which is an AP World textbook that I've used for years and is used all over the country for that class. And then there's Give Me Liberty, which is an AP US History textbook that I've used for a little less time than some of the others, but it's used all over the place, and it's a good book. And then we've got The American Pageant, which is another AP US History textbook. And then finally, Before the Revolution by Daniel K. Richter. And that's a book that I've referenced a number of times, and again, something I hadn't read before I did all this, but I thought was really great, and I highly recommend it. So, the first thing I'm going to discuss is the English Civil War that happens in the 1640s and 50s. And I think maybe the question you might be asking yourself, this is a U.S. history podcast, why is the English Civil War, which, because it is a civil war, means that it is entirely within England and fought between English and Scottish and Irish people. How is that really relevant to the United States or the American colonies, what will be the United States? The changes that happen within England Not only do they affect the English government and the English economy and English society, they also affect the way that British North America is colonized and the approaches that are taken. It's a big deal. It's a real turning point in English history, and it's worth knowing for the purposes of context, like a lot of the stuff that I discuss on this podcast. On top of that, just as an aside, if you are a Game of Thrones fan, as I certainly was, at least the show, I didn't read the books, they're just too dense, and I basically only read nonfiction. I understand they're good, but I didn't get there. I loved the show, minus the last 3 episodes, and part of the reason I really enjoyed it is that there's obviously a lot of nods to historical societies, historical figures in the show. The Dothraki are clearly meant to be like the Mongols. And I think George R.R. Martin has discussed this. And if you're looking at the House of Lannister versus the, what is it? The Wolf House. Now I'm going to totally blank out. Okay, Stark. That's what it was. All right. So if you're looking at, as a big theme of the show, the Starks versus the Lannisters, my understanding is that's supposed to be kind of a reflection of, or an allusion to, the Wars of the Roses in England. And look, it's pretty clear they're meant to be English, and that, I mean, the Starks in the show, they talk like Scots. You know, it's like King in the North. Like Willie from The Simpsons. They talk like they're from Scotland. You know, like Willie does a bit. Or, you know, maybe Northern England. It's meant to be that they're either Scottish or Northern English, one or the other. And then you've got the people in King's Landing. They talk more like they're from London, you know, like, hey, we're from London, you know, and we're Southern English, and we talk like this. You know, I think there is something to be gained just by your appreciation of something like that, I think, increases if you know a little bit about this stuff. There is something to be gained from knowing how various parts of English history unfolded and what they did to affect American history. The English Civil War has both religious and political origins as its root causes. Because why just fight about politics when you can fight about politics and religion, right? I mean, that makes the Thanksgiving family dinner much more enjoyable, doesn't it? But really, though, there's an issue of who should have political power on the one hand, and there's an issue of which religious doctrine should be obeyed or employed throughout the country. The Stuart monarchs, and that's kind of where this starts, right? It's when Elizabeth dies in 1603, and she doesn't have an heir, right? She was the virgin queen because she never married, wasn't really a virgin, but didn't marry, didn't have any heirs, and when she died, James I, who was King of Scotland at the time, he was James VI, he becomes James I of England. And he is a staunch supporter of the Church of England, and even perhaps more importantly, a believer in what is called divine right of kings. And that is the notion that God chooses who is going to be in charge of a country, who is going to be the monarch, and that the monarch derives his authority from God and therefore should answer only to God. Like Tupac, the monarchs thought, only God can judge me. That becomes kind of a common refrain throughout the 17th century in Europe. Probably the go-to example of a divine right king is Louis XIV of France, who takes over in the mid-1600s. I believe it's like 1650. I think it might have been a little before or after that, but it's right around then. And he is considered like the example of a divine right absolutist king. And absolutism is a philosophy that is kind of attached to divine right of kings. And divine right of kings is something that kind of justifies absolutism, which becomes a thing in Western Europe and later in Eastern Europe. And it's sort of what it sounds like. It's this idea that the king rules without having to share authority with anyone. And this is reaching back to earlier episodes that I have recorded and produced and put out there, something that I discussed when I talked about the rise of monarchies and how they became more powerful in the 1400s, the development and evolution of the fiscal military state, which gave kings a lot more power because kings started to control the purse strings, and that meant they controlled the military. And you could kind of see how this would be in the eyes of the monarchs, the logical next step. But in England, there's a little something called Parliament, and there's a little something called the Magna Carta, which was signed in 1215 by King John of England. He was essentially forced to sign it by various vassals, nobles, lords, whatever you want to call them, who thought that he was becoming kind of a tyrant and wanted to assert the nobles' privileges and rights. And that created the beginnings of Parliament, which is a legislature. It is a law-making body, like our Congress, and there are parliaments all over the world now. We have a Congress, that's our version, but there are parliaments, which are legislatures, all over the place. So this dispute really comes down to how much power should the king have, and how much power should Parliament have? And also, how much influence should the Church of England have, and how much religious freedom should people in Scotland and in Ireland? The Scottish are Presbyterians. It's a form of Puritanism, would be, I guess, the simplest way to put it. And then the Irish are staunch Catholics. And so neither of them is really into the idea of being Anglicans, of being adherents of the Church of England. So that's kind of where this all comes from. So the Stuart monarchs, James I, he takes over in 1603, and he tries to consolidate power, evoking divine right in order to do it. He wants to limit the power of Parliament, and he wants to expand the influence of the Church of England. He even writes this kind of famous treatise where he says that divine right and a monarch's powers they go hand in hand, right? That God gives a monarch his powers. He's very clear about this. And he is really something of a scholar. He's serious about the intellectual justifications for the things that he wants to do. He wants more power for himself. I mean, I think most monarchs do. So there's always, I think, this sneaking suspicion, probably more than sneaking, on the part of people in Parliament, like, okay, yeah, he says all this stuff, and he talks a good talk about these legal and moral and ethical justifications for being a more powerful monarch and religious justifications for being a more powerful monarch, but really he just wants to make himself more powerful, doesn't he? Isn't that really what this is about? There are people in Parliament who are skeptical of James I and what he wants to do, because every ounce of power he gets is an ounce of power they are giving up. It's just it's a seesaw. It's a tug of war. That's how it works. So he starts to talk about divine right, although James I does not really do anything super dramatic to push the English government in that direction. The balance of power that existed when he took over as king in 1603 for England, it more or less is the same when he dies in 1625. However, his son, Charles, is a different story. And both James and Charles demanded close adherence to the practices and institutions of the Church of England. They both were divine right supporters. They both looked at religious dissenters, whether it's Presbyterians or Catholics or Puritans, as troublemakers. And they were very much Cartman-esque. Respect my authority! But there was all of this opposition from, as I said, Presbyterians in Scotland, Catholics in Ireland, and Puritans in England to religious conformity and to the authority of the Church of England. And then, of course, there's pushback from Parliament. Eventually, Charles does something really dramatic and just dismisses Parliament. And he rules for over a decade kind of without Parliament. It's called his personal rule period of 1629 to 1640. And he did eventually grow so desperate because of this pushback by what's called the Covenanter movement in Scotland. That first emerges in 1638. And it is centered around objection to resistance to the Church of England, and Charles and James before him, their attempts to make Presbyterians in Scotland respect the ecclesiastical authority, that is, the bishops and so forth, of the Church of England. It's based in that, the Covenanter movement, but it's also based in this idea that, like, they see what these dudes are doing. They see what Charles and his father before him, James, are trying to do to increase their power at the expense of other influential, powerful people, and they don't like it. They don't dig it. So Charles tries to raise an army essentially to crush the Covenanter movement, which, as I said, first emerges in 1638 and then reemerges packaged a little differently in 1643. Charles also wanted to go to war against Ireland because, once again, there was an uprising there, mostly by Irish Catholics, but also by people who just objected to the amount of control that England was continuing to exert over Ireland. Parliament, however, had to approve the funds. Much like in our Congress, Parliament was largely in charge of the purse strings. Okay? They funded things like wars that the monarch would want to pursue. The members of Parliament weren't having it because they saw what Charles was trying to do. He was trying to marginalize them, to push them aside and push for absolutist rule. Once it was clear that they weren't going to cooperate, Parliament raised its own army, and you have these two now warring factions. Those who support Charles because they see their own interests as aligned with him, because they are ardent supporters of the Church of England. There are a number of different reasons. And the people that support the parliamentarians. And that might be because they're Presbyterians. That might be because they're Puritans. It also might be because they're just opposed to absolutism, and they don't want a monarch to be as all-powerful as Charles would like to be. You now got these two warring factions, and they've got some, I think, kind of weird, fun names. So there's the Cavaliers, who are the supporters of Charles and the monarchy, and you've got the Roundheads, who are the supporters of the parliamentarians, and that largely has to do... So, as is the case with the Puritans, I mentioned this in previous episodes, the Puritans are called Puritans by people who are hostile to them. Okay, Puritan is meant as kind of an insult. Like, oh, you're so pure, you're such a Puritan. Both the name Cavaliers and the name Roundheads start off as an insult as well. Cavaliers means it's like, oh, you're this rich, foppish, horse-owning, long-haired fancy boy, right? That's basically the way that the parliamentarians and their supporters characterized or caricatured the English supporters of Charles I. And the Roundheads has to do with their hair, again, that they had this much shorter hair than the aristocratic, fancy pants supporters of Charles I had. It was cut closer to their heads, and therefore they had round heads. They were more simple, plain, like Puritans were, in their dress, in their speech, certainly in their religious worship. And in both instances, these names that started as insults actually became kind of badges of honor for the people who received those names, right? The Roundheads were like, yeah, we're Roundheads, deal with it. And Cavaliers are like, yeah, fuck you, we're Cavaliers, deal with it. Ultimately, the fighting begins in 1642, and it goes kind of on and off. The fighting goes kind of on and off until 1649, when Charles was captured. He was captured once before and managed to escape, but then he's captured a second time in 1649, and ultimately he is put on trial for treason by the parliamentarians and their leader of what's called the New Model Army, Oliver Cromwell, who I've discussed in at least the previous episode, I think perhaps more than that. Oliver Cromwell led the New Model Army and became the sort of de facto leader because of his military command of the parliamentarians, the Roundheads. Charles I is, as I said, captured, put on trial for treason, and ultimately, as again, I think I mentioned in previous episodes, executed. Okay? Which was a big fucking deal. not just in England, but in the entirety of Europe. I mean, it was a momentous event to execute a king, a guy who claimed to be there because God wanted him there. And that was something that a lot of people bought into. So imagine you're somebody who believes the king is supposed to be there, and you see the dude get his head chopped off. That would probably mess with you, I would imagine. And it certainly raised the concerns, the anxieties of other rulers in Europe who saw the execution of a king as just inconceivable before it actually happened. But that didn't end the fighting. That didn't end the English Civil War, because Charles I's son, Charles II, is there, and he's ready to carry on the fight. Cromwell and the Parliamentary Army battle Charles II again on and off until there's a decisive battle in 1651 at it's the Battle of if you're so short aside here. There's a lot of English cities that have their American cousins or versions set up later on, either during the colonial period or afterward, right? For example, there's Plymouth. Plymouth was a city in England. There's Birmingham. There's a Birmingham, Alabama. There's also a Birmingham in England. And that's where that comes from. So in this case, there's the battle of, if it's English, it's the Battle of Worcester. We fell at the Battle of Worcester. Or, I'm going to meet my cousin and we're having tea at Worcester. Versus in America, it's Worcester. Or if you're really into the masshole scene, it's Worcester, as I understand it. It's like, my cousin and I, we went down to Worcester, had a bunch of lager, a bunch of liquor, got wicked drunk, dude. Ugh. So yeah, there's Worcester, or there's Worcester, which is in England, or there's Worcester, which is in Massachusetts. And in this case, we're talking about, obviously, the English version. And at the Battle of Worcester, in 1651, Charles II was defeated, and he fled to France. Cromwell, within a couple of years of that, because there's all this chaos going on, he takes over as, effectively, Winston Churchill called him a military dictator. And there's a lot of disagreement about exactly what his role was and whether he was a, quote, good guy or bad guy. Depends on who you talk to, I guess. Churchill obviously didn't think he was so great. Cromwell takes over as, he calls himself Lord Protector. And he pretty much runs England in an authoritarian manner from 1653 to his death in 1659. In addition to that, he runs this really brutal campaign in Ireland, yet another reason that Irish people are not super fond of English folks, in 1650-51, because he looks at the Irish Catholic resistance as the most dangerous one that there is. He also does, Cromwell, really represses anybody who's not on board with Protestantism in general, and sort of with his puritanical version of Protestantism in particular. So Catholicism as a practice is basically outlawed, and there are a number of instances in which Catholic priests even are executed in Ireland. So it gets pretty ugly. For the colonies, directly, the Civil War means a much more diminished version of immigration to British North America, and really to other parts of Western Hemisphere colonies for Britain as well. That means the Caribbean and Canada and so forth. The one exception is what Cromwell calls his Western design. He is what is referred to as a hot Protestant. He's somebody that wants to really confront Catholics in other parts of the world and wants to expand the influence and domination of Puritanism in particular, of Protestantism really, though, in general. And his Western design was this idea that he was going to expand Protestantism into the parts of the Western Hemisphere that were dominated by Catholic Spain. What this results in is a military campaign against the Spanish portions of the West Indies. There is an attack that is launched against Hispaniola, what is currently the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, that fails. And then there's another attack that is launched against Jamaica, which is much less populated and much less well protected by the Spanish. And thus, the English are able to achieve victory. The English victory in Jamaica is why Jamaicans speak English now and not Spanish. It's not long after Cromwell dies that his whole plan and his rule comes to an end. Okay, obviously his rule came to an end because he's dead. But his son was, in Cromwell's view, meant to kind of succeed him and continue the Commonwealth of England, as they called it. Oliver Cromwell's son was to become the next Lord Protector. However, this whole situation of effectively a military dictator from the point of view of many parliamentarians, that's not what they signed up for. That's not, in their view, what they fought the English Civil War to achieve, was to have somebody like a king, just not calling himself a king, tell them what to do and diminish their authority. So Cromwell's son is pretty quickly pushed aside after Cromwell dies, and you have what is known as the Stuart Restoration. That is, Charles II, who had once fought against the parliamentarians and Cromwell, and who had, as I mentioned, fled to France after his defeat at the Battle of Worcester in 1651, he is invited to come back to become king. And he does, and that is the Stuart Restoration. I talked in previous episodes about Restoration imperialism. Well, that's what this refers to. And it's a meaningful thing for not just England, but for the development of the colonies. With the Stuarts restored, colonial expansion accelerated in 1660. And you have kind of a continuance of the Western design that Oliver Cromwell conceived of against Papists, but it's really that Charles II ends up being a bit more like his father and his father's father than the Puritans end up being comfortable with. And his brother, James II, when he takes over, is especially a lot more like that than the parliamentarians are comfortable with. But all of this experience, at a minimum, it engenders in people who are going to travel to North America and become colonists and populate the original 13 colonies, whether it's Rhode Island or New Hampshire or Pennsylvania or Maryland or South Carolina or whatever. They learn that absolutism and that probably a king in general is not something that they want. And what they do want is a voice in their government. And I think that's one of the most important long-term indirect effects of the English Civil War on the American colonies and ultimately the United States. All right, now I need to get into everybody's favorite topic, macroeconomics. You can feel the excitement, can't you? Look, I know this is a little dry to a lot of people, and strictly speaking, it is not history content, but I do think there is a really important tie between economics and history, and that it's very difficult in my mind to separate them. And this is especially true, I think, for U.S. history in general and for the period of colonialism that we're talking about right now. Because as you will see, there are the seeds of the revolution in the economics of what England and then Britain start to do in this period. So I want to explain this for a little bit. I hope you'll indulge me. And I think you will genuinely get a better understanding of all of this stuff by having sucked it up and soldiered your way through this portion. So, and look, I think it's interesting, but, maybe you don't, and that's cool. But I do think it's worth talking about. Mercantilism. So what is mercantilism? It is an economic philosophy, not unlike how capitalism is an economic philosophy or how communism is an economic philosophy. I think the way I would describe it and the way I have described it to a lot of students in the past, it is kind of capitalism 1.0. It's a bridge of economic philosophy between what I would call a traditional economy that has existed in most of the world throughout most of history, where everything's pretty local. There's some long-distance trade, but not a ton. There's not a lot of investment or investing, and there is a great deal of control over the national economy to the extent that such a thing exists by the monarch and perhaps the upper class of landholders and maybe some merchants and bankers in there. So mercantilism is a step away from that whole system and toward what will eventually be a capitalistic system. So it is an economic philosophy that originates really in Western Europe, I think primarily of England, France, the Netherlands, when I think of this, in the 1600s. The main focus of those who buy into this philosophy is the idea that you want to export more goods than you import. You want a what they call favorable balance of trade. And that is so that if you are, say, England, and you are exporting goods to France, France will owe you a trade balance or a trade debt, and that trade debt can be made up in the form of bullion, okay, which is gold or silver, bars, bricks, coins, whatever. And then you can use that cash, effectively, that precious metals that makes up for the trade imbalance, to do whatever you want. And primarily what advocates of mercantilism believe should be done with it, or sort of induce kings to believe could be done with it, is to strengthen a king's military, whether that is the navy or the army or whatever. And that makes the country more powerful. So a lot of this is still centered on what is good for the state, what is good for the monarchy, and how trade can help to achieve those things. But there is an element of incorporating businesses and investors and banks and business owners to get involved in this whole process. Because this system requires a great deal of cooperation between the government on the one hand and corporations, joint stock companies, on the other hand. And I've explained this a little in a previous episode, but it is worth repeating in my view, either if you missed that or if you don't remember. Bankers and merchants, they come together sometimes to create joint stock companies as a cooperative, as a unit. Sometimes it's just merchants, but either way, a joint stock company is, in the same way that mercantilism is kind of a predecessor of capitalism, a joint stock company is kind of a predecessor of a modern corporation. The state, the government, the king, will grant a monopoly to a company like, say, the Dutch East India Company. And in exchange for being given that very, very valuable monopoly, which means that you as the company do not have to compete with anybody for whatever business you're doing. And that is, ask anyone who knows about economics how valuable a monopoly is. It means you control the production, import, export of a good or service. And that is, imagine, for example, if there were only one cell phone carrier, if there were only one grocery store, if there were only one airline. If any of those things were true, that company who owned that valuable service, whether it's the grocery store or the airline or the cell phone service company, if there was only T-Mobile, let's say, or only American Airlines, or only Safeway or Kroger or whatever you have in your area, they could then charge whatever the hell they felt like for their stuff. And that's not good for consumers, but man, oh man, is that great for the business owners. So having a monopoly that is orchestrated by the government that says that you and only you, or your company and only your company, can import, export, control the trade, sales of a particular good, especially when it's a valuable commodity like, say, sugar or spices or tea or whatever, that is tremendously valuable. And that is why these companies like the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch West India Company, the Virginia Company, the British East India Company, and so forth, were happy, more or less, to do the bidding of the governments in exchange for this monopoly. That's what happens in this system, right, is that joint stock companies emerge to execute the trade policy of a government and help that government achieve a favorable balance of trade. So when a joint stock company and a government love each other very, very much, they come together and they form this cooperation, and you have a mercantilist economic system. Colonies figure into this very prominently as well. They figure into mercantilism. They are supposed to provide the mother countries and these joint stock companies with raw goods, raw materials, okay, such as tobacco, sugar, timber, precious metals, stuff like that, that will then be produced into more of a consumer good. Now, certain things like tobacco and sugar don't require a lot of processes, a lot of refinement, a lot of manufacture to make them into something consumable, although they still do. There's still a good deal of processing that goes on between, raw sugar cane and table sugar or granulated sugar. And there's also a good deal of processing that goes on between harvesting a raw tobacco leaf and actually making it something that you put in cigarettes or in a pipe. So there is something there. It's not as much of a production process as, say, taking timber and making it into furniture, or taking gold and making it into jewelry, or taking cotton and making it into textiles. At least that's how it occurs to me, and maybe that's not totally accurate, but that's certainly how it seems. So colonies provide these raw materials, and they go back to the mother country where they typically are made into consumer goods. And then the colonies, on top of providing these raw materials, which in the typical mercantilism kind of relationship between a colony and a mother country, the colony is only supposed to sell its raw materials to the mother country, and that's it. Okay, so if you are, say, in Jamaica, which is a British colony at this point, an English colony at this point, you as a Jamaican sugar producer are not supposed to sell your sugar or sugar cane to the French or the Dutch or the Spanish or any of their merchants or joint stock companies if they exist, or any of that. You're just supposed to sell the stuff to English joint stock companies or merchants. And then they're supposed to do whatever with it. And then they take it, they alter it, they process it, and they make it into a good that the colonists then can consume. So it's keeping everything in-house. So if you are trading exclusively with your colonies, as England did with Jamaica, and England is not importing sugar from, say, Haiti, which is a French colony, then there's no way that that part of the trade can contribute to a negative trade balance between England and France from England's point of view. Because again, the English want to import stuff only from their colonies, and they want to export stuff to other countries. They don't want to import stuff from France or from French colonies, because then that could contribute potentially to a trade imbalance, which is the cardinal sin of mercantilism, I guess I would call it. Okay, you don't want to do that. Colonies are providing cheap raw materials. They're importing them to the mother country, England or France or wherever, whoever's colonies they might be. Those raw materials are then being made into manufactured goods or to processed goods, and then they're being sold to the colonists and other markets as well. And the first instance you have of government really kind of clamping down on this whole process is actually during Oliver Cromwell's regime, when the first Navigation Act is passed in 1651. And I'm pausing on that because if you know something about the American Revolution in any kind of detail, that should sound at least sort of familiar to you, the Navigation Act, okay? That Navigation Act was passed in 1651 with the goal in mind of challenging Dutch trading dominance. Remember, this is something that is emphasized a little bit more during the Restoration period, which is after Cromwell's rule, but the path is kind of laid out here during Cromwell's rule to challenge the Dutch, who were kind of first to a lot of this stuff. The Dutch were the innovators in terms of banking, in terms of trade policy, in terms of shipping and shipbuilding. The 17th century is often referred to as the Dutch Golden Age, or the Golden Age of the Netherlands, because they developed a lot of this stuff in the Netherlands. Mercantilism kind of has its origins there. So does modern banking. And what the English start to do during Cromwell's regime, and really kind of kick in a high gear during the Stuart Restoration and afterward, is they just kind of steal all the ideas that the Dutch came up with and start to implement them at a larger scale than the Dutch are able to do, because England is a much bigger country. The Netherlands is tiny. Even now it's tiny. Back then it was really tiny. But the English are able to kind of just take the ideas of the Dutch and outdo them because of their larger population and their greater resources. So the Navigation Act in 1651 challenges the Dutch in terms of their trade dominance, because it restricts the colonial trade with Dutch importers, exporters, merchants, whatever you want to call them. It's another way, too, of prohibiting trade with not just the Dutch and challenging them, but also challenging the Spanish, who, remember, Cromwell has kind of a vendetta against because they're Catholic. Okay? So there's a couple of things going on here that in Cromwell's mind are helping him to accomplish a couple of his important goals. And the Stuarts, though they are not hot Protestants, Charles II and James II, not really much of a Protestant at all, as it turned out, they do see the economic advantages of doing this, though they are not in it for the religious reasons. And they start to expand on the things that Cromwell does. Later navigation acts, after the one passed during Cromwell's regime, were actually put into place in 1660, 1663, 1673, and 1696. The whole program and all of these laws are designed to do the same basic thing, which is to keep the trade of the colonies in-house and contribute to this mercantilist goal of not importing more than you're able to export by limiting the amount of goods the English have to import by getting those goods from those raw materials from their colonies rather than from other countries or other countries' colonies. But this is a system that the colonists themselves are not crazy about. Okay? And the Navigation Acts, I would call this laying revolutionary breadcrumbs. Because right out of the gate, the colonists are like, what's this bullshit? They work to restrict, I'm going to read this specifically, colonial trade with other states, especially in staples like sugar and tobacco, ensure that goods shipped to colonies came directly from England and not from other countries. They were transported on English ships, not Dutch ships or Spanish ships, and were manned by mostly English crews, and commerce was conducted through English banks and English merchants, so that all taxes that were going to be levied on this trade could be collected by the English. So there's a tax revenue benefit there as well, in addition to the mercantile goals that we have already discussed. Colonists generally objected to this because they might get a better price for their stuff from the Dutch or from the Spanish or from the French than they would from English merchants. I mean, you can imagine that if these merchants know that it's the law that colonists can only trade with them, they, the English merchants, are not going to be terribly likely to give these people really good prices for their stuff. Whereas in a free market, you, the seller, the producer, are able to get whatever is the best price for your stuff. And that's what the colonists wanted. And this is really the seed of the disagreement between the colonists and the British that will eventually grow into the plant, if I'm going to continue with this metaphor, of the revolution. Okay? It's this notion that the English can dictate to the colonists who they can trade with and how much they can get for their goods, And not only that, they can do it from a great distance and in a body parliament where the colonists have no voice. I suspect now that you're going to see why it was I discussed mercantilism and the English Civil War leading up to this point. Because it's a lot easier to make sense of what I'm going to discuss now when you know that other stuff. The Dominion of New England. This is a big deal. It is often referred to as the first American Revolution. What happens as a result of this? If you want to really kind of understand where the American Revolution comes from, this is, to me, a pretty important place to begin. The Stuart Restoration, as I've already mentioned, led to more aggressive colonial activity. There is Restoration imperialism, whereby the English seek to replace the Dutch in the many places that they had established a foothold. The English seized New Netherland, which I mentioned in the last episode. New Netherland is seized in the lead-up to the Second Anglo-Dutch War, which takes place in 1664, but Charles is restored in 1660. This is 1664, so it's not a huge gap between those two things. Until the 1670s, the English government had largely ignored the North American colonies, and the colonies had been content to administer themselves in their own way. As I've already discussed, and as you know now, there were a lot of things going on back in the UK in the 1640s, 50s, and into the 60s. All of that stuff made it, the friction of distance, the fact that there are thousands of miles between England and pretty much all of the British North American colonies that had been established in the first half of the 1600s, that alone would have made it very difficult for England to administer these colonies. You add in a civil war and a temporary military dictatorship and all of these religious struggles, of course it's going to be hard for the English to govern these colonies. And during that time, the colonies get accustomed to doing things their own way and implementing their governments and just running the show. Okay? Who wouldn't? Oftentimes when I mention this to students, it's kind of the equivalent of your parents trusting you not to have a curfew. And as long as you kind of play by the rules and don't do anything too stupid, they're probably not going to say anything. Into the 1670s, the British government doesn't really say a whole lot. In 1675, though, the English established the Lords of Trade to oversee colonial affairs. It's the first sign that the English are going to start to really take a closer look at what the colonies are doing. Massachusetts, I think it's the Massachusetts Bay Colony specifically, rejects the Lords of Trade assertion that it has the authority to oversee colonial affairs and the Navigation Acts. Massachusetts' argument is that it does not have representation in Parliament. Again, if you're at least relatively familiar with U.S. history, you've heard that before. So this is 100 years, a little less than that, but about a century before that becomes a really important idea and leads to the American Revolution. So it starts here. Massachusetts is not the is the first, but it's not the last to do anything about this. Charles II revoked the Massachusetts Charter as a result of this just before he died. Charles II cites as his justification for revoking Massachusetts Charter the fact that Massachusetts, has not obeyed or abided by the Navigation Acts. Again, that should sound kind of familiar to people who know something about the American Revolution. James II moves to raise more revenue once he takes over as king by consolidating the New England colonies. That is, at this point, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New Haven, Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and he's going to add into that East and West Jersey and New York into one unit. Because in James II's view, this will make the colonies easier to manage. There's one unit. He's going to put one dude in charge of all of this. James II thinks that he's going to get more tax revenue, and it's going to make all of these colonies easier to administer if they are consolidated into one unit. And he puts one guy in charge of it all, and that guy is going to directly oversee, at the very least, collection of taxation revenue. Okay? So, once again, James, now that he's in charge, is saying Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, New Haven, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, East and West Jersey, and New York are all one unit, and that is the Dominion of New England. And this is where, as the kids say, shit gets real. Sir Edmund Andros is appointed as the governor of the Dominion of New England. And that, his appointment and the structure of this unit, the Dominion of New England, effectively nullifies all of the local and colony-wide governance that has been established in the colonies from the early 1600s to this point in the 1680s. All right, so all the town councils, all the state governments, all the state legislatures, all that stuff, which is particularly important and central in the minds of the colonists to those colonists specifically in the New England colonies. Their belief in self-government and their conviction that they have the right to govern themselves is a lot more important to people in New England than it is to people in, say, Virginia or South Carolina or Georgia or places like that, although Georgia doesn't really exist yet. But that is really central to their identity, these people in New England. And now putting this guy in charge, Edmund Andros, over all of them, who can just very easily nullify any of the decisions that these local governments make, of course that pisses them off. Of course they're furious. Because in large part, they came to North America, remember, to do things their own way. These are, in many instances, religious dissenters, and they, especially in the generations prior to the English Civil War, they escaped England and its persecution of their communities, their religious beliefs. So the notion that now all of a sudden you're going to have this colonial governor, this administrator of this Dominion of New England, who's going to answer directly to the king and who's going to be able to tell the local governments that whatever he says goes, that shit doesn't fly with these people in these various New England colonies plus New York and East and West Jersey. He, Andros, doesn't make this any easier by imposing new taxes unilaterally without any approval. He voids previously approved land grants that had already been sorted out, so now all of a sudden people that thought they had land, poof, gone. Okay? And he enforces religious toleration for all Protestants, but not so much for Catholics, which that is less, I think, of an issue in most of these colonies, but it is at least an issue in some places, for example, in Rhode Island, which, if you recall, is the place that a lot of religious dissenters, including Catholics, end up going to in that region. In 1689, something of momentous importance happens in England. It's called the Glorious Revolution. It is the overthrow of James II as king and the replacement of James II with his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, Orange being one of the provinces of the Netherlands. And it's a whole rejiggering, really, of the English system of government. You remember that the English Civil War was about this fight between the king and the parliament and who had which powers at the end of the day. Well, this kind of permanently settles that question, because out of the Glorious Revolution comes the English Bill of Rights, among other things, that lays out Parliament's superiority to the monarchy. From that point forward, and from that point really to this day, Parliament's power in England grew, it got greater, and the monarchy's power has declined to the point where now the monarchs are, they're really just mascots. I guess, look, technically they're still heads of the Church of England, right? Charles the now third, okay, he is the head of the Church of England, which isn't nothing. And there's a ceremonial role that they have, but that's about it. And this Glorious Revolution is what sets the English monarchs kind of on the path toward what they are currently, which is mascots. Glorified mascots. That's how I think of them. What that means so obviously it means big things for England. What it means for the colonies is that it provides them an opportunity to throw off the yoke, the tyranny in their view, of the Dominion of New England. And the Boston militia breaks out. They see this as an opportunity. They jail Edmund Andros. They find him and they throw him in the clink. And other officials that are associated with him and associated with running the Dominion of New England. It overthrows the Dominion of New England effectively and establishes the previously existing governments. In New York, there's this particularly kind of messy situation. There's this guy named Jacob Leisler who seizes control of New York in the chaos of the Glorious Revolution. Maryland's Protestant Association also overthrows the proprietary government of Lord Baltimore. And there's already been, as I discussed in the previous episode, this back and forth between Protestants and Catholics in Maryland. This is another episode of that, where Protestants, who are in the majority, despite the fact that the proprietary owners of Maryland are Catholic and want to see it as a Catholic haven on some level at least, the Protestants are the majority and they seize control during the chaos that is the Glorious Revolution. Leisler, the guy in New York, he angers a lot of the influential merchants. They ask for help from England, these merchants do, because of Leisler's practices and who he favors when he takes over. Leisler ultimately is captured and executed as there is a military force dispatched from England to help deal with him. His followers are imprisoned. Most of them are pardoned, but Leisler himself is executed. And the bad feelings from this don't go away immediately. There are these pro and anti-Leislerian factions of people in New York that are there and that are pushing back against one another from this period all the way up to the American Revolution. So this is not something that's the reason I'm mentioning it, is that this is not something that goes away, and it's something I'll come back to in later episodes. The Protestant-dominated government controls Maryland until 1715, when proprietary control is restored, and the Baltimore family eventually kind of gives up their crusade and converts to Anglicanism. They sort of abandon the notion that this is going to be some Catholic haven, as evidenced by their own personal conversion. And all of this that happened, I think you can see why this is called the First American Revolution. It certainly foreshadows a lot of what's going to happen, and the later American Revolution echoes a lot of this. That's it for this episode. Thank you all for hanging with me. I always appreciate it. Of course, please, please, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. You can contact me at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com, or leave a voicemail or a text or anything like that you would like at 951-525-5536. Thanks again for listening. Really appreciate y'all. Take care, and I will catch you next time.
Turn it up.